All right, good morning and welcome back, everyone. So today's lecture is going to be an audio-only lecture. I have a bad hair day, so I don't want to show it to the world. No. Sometimes it just uploads. These videos are processed and upload easier and more quickly when I just do the screen. But usually when I teach online, I like to have that little picture of myself there. So in the future. So for now, just listen to what I have to say, I guess, and go through the slides. So this lecture covers chapter 1 and just a few of the kind of primary topics, and I'll be bringing up examples in this, and especially as we get into more of the substantive material. So obviously, first of all, we want to think of sociology as a science, in the sense that we use logical reasoning, we have systematic theories to explain things, methods to test those theories, and basically the process of research is never ending. We haven't figured out everything. There's always another why, even when it does seem like you have successfully determined what a causal relationship might be. So again, I just want to remind you to make sure to get the textbook, Understanding the Social World. Again, we're going to be online at least until January 15th, maybe longer, or we may come back and then be forced back online again. So again, just be ready for some of these potential changes. You can find most of this material on Gaucho Space. Okay, my apologies, I had to stop the video for a second. Again, the pack-back discussion will appear probably today or tomorrow, definitely by the end of the week. So, you may or may not want to post this week. Remember, you can decide which weeks you want to post. So anyway, I will let you know when that is all set up and ready to go. So I do want to kind of start out today by, looking at the history of sociological research and methods, particularly some of these old influential studies. So you remember Emil Durkheim, who is one of the classic founders of sociology. One of his first studies that was based upon statistics and empirical data, a study that would look like a study we would do today, was this investigation of suicide. And so Durkheim was very interested in the idea of suicide, in the sense that it is something that seems very individual and very personal, and he wanted to know if there were social trends that we saw. He looked at France, and obviously this is in the French language, but he tended to find that there were higher levels of suicide rates in certain areas, among certain members of the population. Some of it is just reflects France at that time. One area that we do see similarities, former vets, military vets, there was high suicide rates then after the First World War, I believe he was studying, or other things that the French had gone into. And so this really kind of opened the way for future sociological research. They were even using maps, as you can see there. If you remember last time we talked about Ernest Burgess and the use of maps at the University of Chicago. Now again, Durkheim, while looking for the broader social trend in suicides, he also knew that suicide is a very personal thing. As he says here in this quote, each victim of suicide gives his act a personal stamp which expresses his temperament, the special conditions in which he is involved, and which constantly cannot be explained by the social and general causes of the phenomenon. So he says that even if there is some, clear wave of suicide happening in a society, that even with so many people taking part, every individual has, makes a certain choice about this. And so while he was recognizing the importance of social trends, he did not discount the importance of individual psychology. Less well-read sociologists and other social scientists don't know that, or don't really realize that he also understood the individual was very important. So if we fast forward to today, look globally at suicide rates. As you can see, some of the lowest ones are Turkey, Greece, interestingly neighbors, along with Italy, Mexico, low suicide rates overall. Then you see where the highest suicide rates are, at least per 100,000 people. Hungary is pretty high. South Korea scores the highest. Interestingly, on a number of international surveys that have been done, South Koreans generally score as some of the happiest and well-adjusted people, but you do see a clear trend of suicides happening at much higher rates than you see in other places. So, sociologists, if they looked at that, they might come up with interesting ideas about why this might be. One of the first things you might want to do is, look and see what's happening in Korea. Who exactly is it that's committing suicide? And here you see that it's overwhelmingly people age 65 and older. That's basically the same for China, and Hong Kong to a lesser extent. OECD is basically all rich countries, so again, for all rich countries, it's a bit higher for people in their late 60s than elsewhere. But again, South Korea is really an outlier here, and to tackle what this shows, I think, for those of us interested in like social psychology and well-being, is that there's appears to be a crisis happening amongst the elderly population in South Korea, leading to these huge numbers of suicides. For a long time, Japan got a lot of attention for its suicide rates because they tend to be amongst the working age population. And here we see the effects of competition and, just modern life and the modern economy and so on. If we look at what's going on with some of the European countries that are, somewhat similar to the United States in terms of wealth, education, things like that, you can see that for the most part, point out that on the bottom we've got from 1980 to 2014, for the most part, countries' suicide rates have been falling, in some cases falling fairly dramatically. But then we've got the U.S., this red line here, and you see basically starting around 2000, it goes up. And if we were to extend this to 2021, I don't know what the rates are for other countries at the moment, but I would not be surprised if we saw upticks in suicide rates across the world. The first few months of the pandemic, I know in the United States, saw fewer suicides than was expected. Nevertheless, that was before many of the lockdowns had kicked in and so on and so forth. Well, what about the younger people? Again, going to the United States, we see that there's this general uptick in suicide rates happening. So what's going on there? So why don't we look at teens? So we know that there's a lot of teen suicides as well, and these are especially tragic because they're often, so young and have so much more life to live, and a number of times whatever is causing their depression may be reduced in a few years. But again, anyway, so we see that suicide rates start rising quite dramatically throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Excuse me, kind of peaking in 1990, then kind of drop, and essentially they've plateaued over the last 20 years. Maybe they've gone up a little bit. I'm not quite sure. So that's pretty interesting right there. What's caused this huge jump in teen suicides? Before I continue talking about suicide, just talk about another sort of age group. So we're looking at people who are 45 to 54, and this was a quantitative study looking at death rates in 2010. looking at white non-Hispanic Americans and, the white majorities in France, Germany, UK, Canada, all these other countries. Again, you see that there's a much higher mortality rate for people who are essentially middle-aged in the United States than you see in other parts of the world. So something is happening with white people in the United States. So again, roughly the same age group, maybe a little bit older. You see that in terms of mortality, a lot of it is being driven by white people who have a high school diploma or who have dropped out of high school and have no high school degree. You can see that their mortality rates really jump after 2010. And, why that is, well, there's the opioid crisis that's definitely played a role. Social media, I think might be playing a role, as I'll explain in a moment. And if you look at the white population in general, has not changed. The mortality rate, at least in this age group, has really not changed over the last 20 years. Now, Ernest Burgess would love the tools of GIS, Geographic Information Sciences. When I was a graduate student here at UCSB, I actually took part in, or actually took the GIS class, the undergraduate one, the year-long series of courses. And even though I'm an urban and environmental sociologist, I never ended up actually using it in my dissertation. But there are many ways that it can be used. So sticking to this topic of suicide, this is, breaking it down again. If you're looking at suicide in white men versus suicide in white women, why are we talking about them? They generally have the highest suicide rates in the United States. So the dark red is where you have the highest suicide rates. Blue is where you have fewer. So you see far fewer suicide rates amongst women than you see amongst men. You also see some regional differences. Go to men. So they tend to be, actually fairly low in Santa Barbara, for example, comparatively, but you see that across a lot of western states and in rural parts of other states, you tend to see these pretty high rates of suicide. So what's going on here? Sometimes I'll ask students this in the classroom and get a variety of responses. Maybe it has to do with social isolation, the lack of mental health facilities, or even just basic healthcare facilities. Things like that generally is what people think is the answer. And I would say that, a lot of that is correct. There is a lot of social isolation. There certainly is a lack of healthcare facilities and things like that. Nevertheless, there's one thing that people often don't think about, and I always have to prod people to think about this. Consider what people living in rural areas are more likely to have than people, say, living in, compact urban areas like New York City or even Los Angeles. And that happens to be a gun. So, men living in Wyoming or Nevada are more likely to own guns than people living in, San Francisco or, many of the other big cities around the country. So that's actually the main reason why suicide rates are so much higher. I mean, the main reason why they're so much higher. Men generally don't seek out help. And in many places, especially some of these rural areas, men have more access to firearms and probably already own a few. Nevertheless, when we sort of backtrack again, looking at depression rates, this is coming from the data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which we'll talk about survey development later. This comes from the book by Jonathan Haidt, The Coddling of the American Mind. You see this jump in depression amongst adolescent females beginning roughly around 2011 or so. Not, a slight rise for males, but really not very far. And these are cisgendered people we're talking about. Now, I took this picture at a conference by Jonathan Haidt. So I'm not sure if I think this comes up in one of his studies. But anyway, this is looking at hospital admission for non-fatal self-harm in girls. So girls who have taken to self-mutilation, but did not succeed, but went to the hospital for it. So in terms of people who are in their late teens, 15 to 19, young women, there's been a 62% increase since 2009. Pretty big for, roughly college age women aged 20 to 24, a 17% increase, and that would be normally a huge increase if it wasn't along with some of these other dramatic numbers. I think this is really kind of shocking and disturbing. For girls age 10 to 14, there has been a 189% increase in hospital admissions for self-harm. That's an incredible leap, really beginning in 2009. So you can sort of hypothesize what's been going on here. First thing, social media. Social media is definitely a factor. However, social media has been around for quite some time. Even before the 2000s, there were a lot of social media sites. Maybe they weren't as, quite engaging as the ones today, but, there were certainly people online on Facebook and MySpace and a number of these other companies during this period of, the 2000s. So, what is it then about 2009, 2010, this period where we see depression rates, especially among girls, really, really spike? Well, social media is a big part of it, but social media itself doesn't provide a good enough answer. Well, what happened in 2007? Well, the iPhone, the smartphone came out. Steve Jobs came out, gave his famous introduction to the iPhone, and pretty soon you're able to, take pictures of yourself and post it online. And that has had, as we now know, a massively damaging effect on young girls. This has come out over the last few months in Facebook documentation. Facebook knew they were causing harm. So I've long argued that this is probably a result of social media plus the smartphone. People would be less able to take pictures of themselves and compare with their friends and so on. So I think it's a combination of both of these things. But definitely social media companies, as we now know, knew what was going on, knew what effect this was having on young girls and women, and did absolutely nothing about it. So again, some of you are in this group. Some of the women in the class definitely fall somewhere in this category. Not that you're 10 or 11 right now, but maybe when this study was done, you were probably in your teens. Anyway, so as I said, we know that internet use has increased over time. We also know that people who use it tend to experience more unhappiness the longer that they're on it, which is quite revealing. And I think the book talks about that in greater detail. Okay, now to jump right into some of these methodological ways in which to investigate the world. There are basically four of them. The first one is observation. And there are problems there. First of all, observation, as I think I talked about last time, you just kind of observe what's going on, but there's different ways in which you can do it. And one is there's two problematic ways in which you can do it. One is selective observation, This is when we look at only things that line up with what we think. As this cartoon shows, my argument is O, and this person says, well, mine is X, and I can prove it with X data. And you find the data that link up to your view. You throw them at your debate partner, and they essentially do the same thing, and you don't get anywhere. And that's essentially the story of social media and politics today. Other things, other problems. Well, you could be making an inaccurate observation. This is obviously something that's very clear. If you've spent any time studying prejudice or unconscious processing, your unconscious processing when you see someone or observe a situation, that we're pretty bad at describing things. So oftentimes in the past, people would be observing and taking notes, which is great. You're documenting things, but again, you may not know the situation and maybe looking at it from an outside perspective, and you may just inaccurately observe what's going on. And this happens quite often, and is one of the biggest problems actually with observational research. One thing is generalizing. Another area which can be problematic is overgeneralization. So what you're trying to generalize, especially as sociologists, but you don't want to go too far. You don't want to conclude that something is generalized and applies to all cases when that may not be actually true. Our experiences are pretty limited, and that refers to our own observational experience and abilities, but also what we know in science and what the literature can tell us. So in social psychology, for example, for decades, there was a lot of overgeneralization happening, and it's, finally now sort of being corrected. There's the famous Mueller-Lyer illusion. Where you're asked which of these lines is longer. A lot of people will say B, and the trick is that these are actually both the same length, but it's these sort of non-vertical lines, I guess, the pointer lines that are turned in different directions, and that for whatever reason, help us to misinterpret the length of these lines. Now, what's kind of interesting is okay, so this was done, and Americans overwhelmingly, would say that B is longer. So that's what made it into the textbooks, and that was what was taught to, millions of undergraduates for decades. And then someone said, well, why don't we try this in a different culture? Why don't we go around the world and, test these in very different cultures and, see what other people think. And, we'll see if we get the same results. And they did not. Now, what's very interesting is that Americans were much more likely to fall for the illusion than the other 12 cultures that they tested. And they were primarily looking at non-industrial societies. So these are people who are living in basically like huts or tents, things like that. So they're not living in the sort of box-shaped reality that we are, where we have carpeting and so on and so forth. So kind of this is what the theory is right now, that the reason perhaps why Americans and others in modern societies may think this is longer is because we've been used to sort of these lines in these sort of situations and these visual ranges situation. I'm not quite sure what the technical word is for that, but you can kind of see what it is. Now, again, I'll just say this is the going theory now. It could be proven wrong in a couple of years. But it's important to do that kind of research where you maybe do one study here in America, Maybe you do it, say, in Santa Barbara, and you want to know, well, do I get the same results elsewhere? And you go to New York or Missouri or wherever. So Jonathan Haidt developed what he calls the moral foundations, people's moral foundations, and they're related to politics. So he has on the bottom here, starting off very liberal, going all the way to very conservative. Basically, if you end up over here, it's very conservative. Over here, very liberal. And then there are these different ways in which they are analyzed. So liberals are they're most identified by their desire to reduce harm and increase fairness. People who are very conservative, they would like to actually do those same things to some group, but they're also motivated by the in group, their own group, more motivated by authority, as well as purity. And purity can be everything from racial purity to organic foods and things like that. So even purity is kind of a strange concept. So consistently, he has found that liberals score high on these first two, conservatives on these last three. Now, so that's all fine and good, but what happened when you go and do this around the world? Well, he's done that. They've went around the world. They've tested this in every continent and various countries in different continents, and you see the same basic outcome. He has a TED Talk. His name is Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, from like 10 years ago, maybe even longer than that, where he kind of explains this research. So it's been around a while, and it's actually been refined and perfected over the years. If you've taken my political sociology class, Soc 131, you're familiar with this because you end up having to take the survey and write about it. Okay, going back to methods. So again, I was talking about generalization. This was not actually an overgeneralization because they were able to, if they would have, let me back up. If they would have just done the studies in the U.S. and said this applies to humanity, that would have been overgeneralization. But since they went and carried out the study multiple times in different places, they were not overgeneralizing. They were actually doing what you want to see done. They were replicating the study. Okay, jumping back into sort of methodological issues. Reasoning is a big part of it, obviously, trying to understand how these different variables or social processes or whatever you're looking at, how they fit together. And oftentimes we do a lot of illogical reasoning, and this will be jumping to conclusions or arguing based on the basis of invalid assumptions. It's kind of hard to spot illogical reasoning because oftentimes you don't have all the data that others do. So oftentimes a scientist might come up with some interesting finding, and so they'll just jump right to the conclusion. There are different types of reasoning. Inductive, where you're just kind of in your own head theorizing how these things fit together. Deductive reasoning is when you're kind of thinking about things in a stepwise fashion. I'll get into those in more detail as we get there. Okay. Other things, reevaluating. So we know, for instance, that there's a tendency for people to resist changes. And some of this has to do with, people not wanting to change, to deal with a bureaucracy too much. And so some of the resistance to change comes from people's egos. They don't want to, change. They think this method works just fine. Or there's sort of institutions that are very connected and are affected by by the decisions that people make. devotion to some sort of tradition, even if things have been proven statistically not to work, people may still stick to their traditions. I was part of a research group that was looking at refugees from the Central African Republic that ended up in the neighboring country of Chad. And one of the problems was that a lot of them were sticking with, I should say, that they were rejecting modern medicine in favor of their own practices, which were not working. And so one of the things that we had to do was research how to get people to take modern medicine when they're traditionally opposed to it. And that's an ethical issue as a researcher. Do I want to, help with this tribe's, help this tribe leave its former practices? If it was like religion or something like that, I may not have wanted to do that, but we're talking about human health here and people who are really dying from easily treatable illnesses. So anyway, that's some of the things we see there with reevaluating the research. And there are different types of research. One is also descriptive. Here, as it sounds, so you're just kind of describing what the research is, or I'm sorry, you're describing the phenomenon. So we'll be talking about a lot of descriptive research, because before you can make a causal argument to say that, low income and poverty and so on lead to have a negative impact on learning and educational development, first of all, you need to sort of just describe the situation. What percentage of students are in poverty, what percentage of them are not getting their nutritional needs met, that kind of thing. So before you can get to the point where you're where you can even make causal arguments, you've got to describe the process itself. So once you've done that, you've just kind of maybe done some descriptive research, then you might want to do a bit further, get into exploratory research. You're trying to find out how people get along in these settings. So you've got all this data about, the lives of people in poverty, students in poverty, and those who aren't. Maybe we talk about another variables. Maybe they have a single parent family, that kind of thing. So then you want to know, okay, how are these kids doing at their home life, academically? Do they get much time for homework? Do they get help from parents, and so on? What meaning do they give to their actions? This could be of the parents themselves or the kids, and so on. So exploratory research, you're getting a little bit deeper than just descriptive. You're trying to understand then the whys. You're kind of getting to some of the potential research questions for a big project. Now, there's also evaluation research. Some of you may be doing this for your jobs later on in life. So evaluation research is kind of, as this Venn diagram shows, it's kind of in the meeting of the social research that we're talking about and then program evaluation. So say we'll just stick with schools, say you have an after-school program for kids who are struggling and they can stay an extra hour or something like this. So you're going to want to know something about the kids who are there, who's likely to be in this after-school program. Let's say that it's voluntary. Who's likely to enroll in it, or whose parents are likely to make their kids enroll in it. And then the program itself, how does it work? Are we seeing an increase in grades, or, just better and improvements in those sorts of metrics and so on? That's all program evaluation. The social research aspect would be, who are these kids? What's their home life like? Maybe how do they get to school? Do they have breakfast? Things like that. And so you put them together, and there you've got some pretty good evaluation research. Again, if you're working for a big company in HR, or if you're working in government for certain government agencies, you'll be doing a lot of this evaluation research, and this is essentially what it is. Again, there are different methods. We've kind of talked about this. I'm not going to go over it in a whole lot of data. A whole lot of detail. Jeez. Okay. So some of the primary methods for quantitative analysis are surveys and experiments. We'll go over those in much more detail later on in this class. The data then become these numbers or attributes that you can sort of align by magnitude. And then you're not just counting up to do a quantitative analysis that is beyond just a descriptive analysis and more of an exploratory or an explanatory study. Then you're looking for correlations. You're looking to see if one variable has an effect on another, and other things that we'll go over in greater detail. So quantitative methods are right now kind of the gold standard of research, because you're able to systematically address a question or a research problem. And you can get a lot of data from a lot of people, and it works pretty well. And if you do surveys or experiments, and then you can crunch some numbers pretty easily. And so there are wonderful things about quantitative analysis. Some of the best research is quantitative. But it doesn't answer everything. So quantitative methods aren't always the best for kind of exploratory research, or even just descriptive research. And sometimes they'll miss the causes, and because you don't have the numerical data that might provide that. And so that's why qualitative research is so important. Sometimes qualitative research can be mixed with quantitative research as just kind of another way in which to study some social issue. We'll talk about that, especially when we talk about, as I give examples on certain types of study, like authoritarian research and things like that. So qualitative research, participant observation, interviewing, focus groups, usually these observations don't have a numerical interpretation. You're analyzing written or spoken words. Now, so sociology, then, what we would call quantitative research, this comes out of what we would call the positivist tradition. Qualitative research comes out of what we would call the interpretivist condition. So sociology was essentially started by Auguste Comte. At least he came up with the word sociology, wanted to develop a science of society that was kind of like the natural sciences. And in terms of the early sociologists, you had kind of a division. You had people like Durkheim and Comte who basically said, yes, sociology is a science. We can understand it through quantitative analysis. Key study, as we talked about, was suicide. But then there's also interpretivism. And while it's not so clear, I think Max Weber might have said, well, yeah, it is a science, but you can't measure it in the same way. The idea here is that you have to, instead of using social facts, things like poverty or race and ethnicity and gender, all these things that are categories we develop for sociological analysis. Verstehen is this German word that basically means you sort of do your analysis with this back and forth between your own theories in your mind and the data that you're looking at, oftentimes historical and so on. So it's usually done through qualitative analysis that we just talked about, usually more micro. One of the key studies here is Discovering Suicide in 1978. And the reason why we have this here is that it's kind of a contrast to Durkheim's positivist analysis, and which was done in 1897. This was 1978. All the same numbers, just aligned a little bit differently. Okay, so again, positivist, this is the belief that's shared by most scientists, that there is a reality that exists outside of observation, and you can access this through general laws. And I've got this video to watch here in a moment. Get all this ads and crap away. Go back here. So you can, again, this is using the data from the General Social Survey, looking at happiness, and looking at trust from 1972 to 2012. So people were asked a simple question, generally speaking: would you say that most people can be trusted, or that you can't be too careful in dealing with people? So you can see the red means people are more the darker red means people are less likely to be trusted. The green is where people are more likely to be trustworthy, are more likely to say that most people can be trusted. So you can look at the changes over time. You know, someone made this kind of cool interactive map. You can see that, kind of waiting for it to start over again. Here we go. 1972, you have a lot of more trusting people in the Midwest. 80s, you know, a lot of people are trusting, are getting more trustworthy or trusting other people. It's really about 1990 when we start to see levels of trust decline. So here we are, you know, well, there we were in 2012, you saw it. But anyway, that's just the type of thing that you can do with social survey data. The General Social Survey is this huge study survey that's done in the United States. If you take any statistics class in the social sciences, you'll often, at least initially, be working with some of that, with some of the social survey data. Oops. Okay, so the other method, constructivism or interpretivism, basically means that you're not just counting things, but you're trying to understand the ways in which the different stakeholders or social actors, how they socially construct how they view the world, how they develop meaning, essentially. Something that's harder to analyze quantitatively. So this approach was developed by Lev Vygotsky. I can't read any of this stuff, but anyway, he was the one who essentially developed the term social constructivism. Through others, we become ourselves, and you really kind of focused on social interaction as very important for the construction of how we see society and how we see the world. So as I said, we don't really rely on his theories too much anymore. He had these kind of stages that were sort of set up. They kind of developed. Modern linguists would throw all this out, and developmental psychologists and so on. But the important thing is that, again, this was pretty early that he was doing this. He died in the 1930s. Lived in, born in the 1890s, so it was pretty young when he died. But this was really before a lot of research in this area. A lot of, groundbreaking child psychology was done. But anyway, this was one of the first attempts to look at how people construct reality. And what's important is the language and culture of a community. So he did recognize that that's very key to understanding social construction. So different ways, different things you can do in your research. Sometimes you'll come across this term triangulation. So what exactly is this? What does it do? Triangulation is basically when you use essentially three, to make it a good triangle, three methods or multiple methods to study one research question. We call that triangulation. So one of the famous studies that used a lot of triangulation that we'll kind of talk about throughout the course, because it just uses a lot of data, and there's a lot of interesting things about authoritarianism that probably deserve to be studied right now. So the study of the authoritarian personality was done using primarily interview data and these statistical surveys, the survey that was done. And so they use different approaches to try to understand authoritarianism. I should say this is in the aftermath of the Second World War. They're doing this research in the 1950s, trying to find out, okay, what the hell just happened back there in Germany with the rise of fascism? Is there a certain type of person that's more likely to be a fascist? That was essentially their research question. Are there people or personality types that are more likely to become fascistic and authoritarian? Can't read this very well, I'm sorry, but for a long time, as I'll talk about, for about almost 50 years, there was not a lot of research on this topic. And now we're seeing like a huge, just a huge explosion of research on the topic. But some of us have been following this longer than others, such as me, so I can give you an idea of what's been going on. So one of the main reasons I think that this authoritarian personality study, when it came out in the 50s, it was just this huge study, and everybody meaning social scientists, were reading it and trying to find out, okay, how good is this study? They found a lot of problems with it, especially with the F scale, the one that was supposed to measure fascism. And there's Mussolini, the founder of fascism. So here you've got some of the sort of items, what they were looking at: bad manners, war and conflict, Pearl Harbor Day, discipline, sex crime, all these different things. And what ended up happening is that they were asking about just too much stuff that didn't really have a whole lot to do with authoritarianism or fascism. And they were kind of ripped apart by the next 2 or 3 decades worth of research, pointing out all the problems with the F scale and the way it was constructed. Again, when we get into developing surveys, I'll kind of talk about that and why this was kind of problematic and some of the ways that the problems have been addressed. Looking at qualitative research on the same topic, on, say, authoritarianism, that we're seeing today, the sociologist who I believe is still at Berkeley, Arlie Hochschild, wrote this book a few years ago called Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. If you click on this link, you can see an interview that was done with her in 2016 before the elections. You can also, there's video of her in discussion with others about fascism, authoritarianism, populism, all these different kinds of things. But she did this research back in 2015 or earlier, and went down to Louisiana and what is now very heavy Trump country, and she interviewed a number of people and found that a lot of them felt that society had just kind of passed them over and abandoned them. They had no desire for some trendy coffee shop to open up and so on, what you're seeing in the larger cities and so on. And so a lot of these people in rural America then are feel embittered because what they're seeing in the media and so on doesn't seem to reflect their own lives. And even if American society and culture kind of overemphasized rural America, I'm from rural America originally, from Nebraska, so I can say whatever I want about rural America. So anyway, even if rural America for a long time was perhaps idealized and kind of shown, there's kind of an inaccurate picture shown of rural America today. We often see, rural America just denigrated as, just where hillbillies and hicks live, and hillbillies and hicks has all sorts of negative connotations, and so on. But, you see these people who around the country feel this way, and, they just need some great leader to come along and, tell them that, those elites have messed it up for them, and, we just got to get rid of that. All right, everyone. So that's the end of my lecture. I do want to just remind you that there are a couple of videos in Gaucho Space that, if we were in an auditorium, I would play them during my lecture, but we're not, so you can watch those videos on your own time and just wait the next couple of days for the weekend. All right, everyone, have a good week.